Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the closed Sicilian. So the Sicilian defense starts out with e4, c5, and then the main line is the open Sicilian, and that is knight to f3. That's what most people are familiar with. And then black's usually going to play knight to c6, could play pawn d6. You can have an exchange in the center of the board, maybe knight f6, knight c3. You can get into the Najdorf defense. It doesn't matter what variation, the accelerated dragon, the dragon, all these variations from black in the Sicilian defense have very aggressive lines. That's why a lot of players, when they're playing black, tend to prefer starting with the c5 because they have so many good lines, and you see some high win percentages from black, which generally you tend to see that on white's side of the board. So the closed Sicilian says, yeah, we're not going to play knight to f3 because that's where most of the players are comfortable from black side, is if you play that knight to f3. So closed Sicilian says, I'm going to play knight to c3 instead. And I think there's two main reasons why you would want to play this. The first one is most players from black's standpoint, they don't have something that's as aggressive that's going to win nearly as often against the closed Sicilian. The second reason is I think it has some very easy repetitive variations that you can go down, so that you don't have to wonder, okay, if they play this variation, because there's so much theory behind the Sicilian defense where you have to make sure you don't make any mistakes. When you play the closed Sicilian, you can pretty much stick to the same game plan and have a really, really solid opening, which from white's standpoint, I think that's many times what you should be trying to do and not trying to get caught up in, did I remember this one move in the specific variation? So we're going to look at some of the main lines that you'll see after you play knight to c3 here on the second move. The first variation that you may see is knight to c6. And from here, I'd recommend playing g3. Yes, there are other options that you can play. You can always play knight to e2, getting ready to push forward with pawn d4. You could just play d3 right here. You could also bring your light square bishop to b5. So lots of different options. I think it's just easiest to go ahead and play g3. This is going to get ready to fianchetto the bishop here to g2. You're going to have an extremely strong foundation. Eventually, you will play d3. Both your bishops can get outside the pawn chain and attack freely, but it's very difficult for black, doesn't matter what variation they play, to disrupt your plan, which I think is a very strong way to go if your opponent is playing the Sicilian defense. So once you play g3, they have some options. If they want to mirror the exact same thing, that's completely fine. So g6, both of you fianchetto your bishops to the king side of the board, and then we'll just play d3. Getting ready to bring your dark square bishop out here. They may do the same thing, solidify their pawn chain, d6, and then knight to f3, getting ready to castle on the king side. They may do the same thing. Knight to f6, castle on the king side. They could play bishop down here to e6. They could castle on the king side as well. But you can see it's pretty safe. They're not putting much pressure on white. White has a very strong foundation, which is what you want in the early game. Now, if they don't go with g6 early on, maybe they don't want to mirror exactly what you are doing, they could instead just play knight to f6. I would still continue bishop here to g2. And then maybe they want to push forward with e5, making sure that you don't push forward here on d4. That's completely fine. If they do that, I would just play d3. Same thing as before. If they want to continue now with g7, same plan, knight to f3, getting ready to castle on the king side as well. If they say, yeah, I don't want to fianchetto to the king side, maybe bishop to e7, getting ready to castle as well. You can still do the same thing, knight to f3. Now, if we come back instead of e5, maybe they play d6. Okay, from here we can just play d3. Very similar moves as before, but it really doesn't matter where black goes. They can't stop us from doing what we're trying to do. Now, one thing that you will notice is if they try d5, now if they kind of look at the calculations, they may say, yes, the pawn can take right here, or even the knight can take. And if the knight takes, there could be an exchange right here. But then the knight's going to move, and the knight and the queen are both defending this. Right now, just the bishop is defending this. So, yes, there's only one defender and two attackers from black standpoint. But then we're going to be looking at knight to e2. And then after the knight takes on d5, both sides are equal in material, but it's going to be hard for black to actually hold on to all this material because of the move d4. Now, both sides have 7 pawns, but if there is an exchange in the board after queen to d4, really white's going to be threatening c4. And this is going to either win material or it's going to put black in a very, very difficult spot, even if they decide to try to hold on to it with e6. Castle kingside if you want to stop the queen coming down here to put you in check, but the eventual move of c4 is really where black's going to be put in a tough spot. So you won't see d5 too often because they may not even recognize how they can even try to hold on to the material. But if you do see the e5 early on, just know go ahead and capture that material with your knight. And then after there is an exchange in the middle, you are eventually going to be looking to play d4 and then c4 at some point. Now, instead of knight to f6 from the very beginning of this, if you play this g3, they could decide to play d6. Now, these are all very common moves. There's not a lot of variations that they could go because you can see their bishops can't move yet. It's kind of blocked off. Their knight really has nowhere to go, and the knight from here is really only going to come to f6. So there's only a few options that you'll see here. But if they do decide to play d6, same thing as before, bishop to g2. If they play knight to f6, get their knight involved into the game, still pawn to d3. Very, very solid structure for white. Nothing they can do to stop what you're trying to do. Now, they don't have to play knight to c3. Another option that you could see is pawn to e5. I would continue with the same plan with g3 here, and then they could play knight to c6. This would essentially be the same thing as before, just a different move variation to get here, but bishop to g3 here. If instead they play knight to f6, I would still play bishop to g3. Really the only thing where I'm looking to do something different is in this position, if they now decide, okay, after e5, and we play this g3, if they now decide to play g6, I may change things up here and play knight to f3. And the main reason for this is if they now decide to play bishop to g7, which is pretty common, trying to defend this pawn, or even if they decide knight to c6, which is also pretty common, then we could play bishop to c4. So this bishop is attacking this pawn here on f7, and let's say they were to bring bishop to g7, and they don't have to. If they don't, you can see we still have a solid structure here. We can always play pawn to d3, castle on the king side, but they may continue with their plan. Most of the time, if you're playing pawn to g6, you're going to fianchetto to the king side of the board, but once they do that, then all of a sudden, knight to b5. Now this is threatening the knight coming here to d6 check, and then black is going to be forced to move their king, which is not what you want to be doing in this setup. So they may play d6, and then you have the pretty aggressive move here of knight to g5. So both the bishop and the knight here are both attacking this weakened square here on f7. This would be the main reason that early on I would play that knight to f3 instead of fianchettoing my bishop here to g2, because you will see this position quite often, and I think it's really good from white's standpoint. So if we play that, and then maybe they take the knight here on g5, which is kind of the bait that we are putting out there, then knight takes on d6 check. Your opponent is going to be forced to move. Now, depending on where they move, they have lots of different options to mess this up. They could always play something poorly like king to d8, and then you have check, and this is forking the queen right here. If they move somewhere else here, you can still take this material, and it puts them in a world of hurt. Even here, you could play knight takes on f7, and then you're attacking both the queen and the rook right here. So I really like this position. The king can no longer castle. That would be the one place where I would say I like the knight to f3 instead of bringing your bishop here to g2. Next variation that you could see is d6. This is the most common in the open Sicilian, and so you may also see it in the closed Sicilian as well. I would keep things pretty easy. g3 here. If they want to continue with knight to c6, this is very similar setup as all the other openings, just a different move order here. Bishop to g2, maybe knight f3, knight f6, d3. It's all pretty much the same right here. The main difference that you will see in these openings is if they don't play a standard move, maybe instead of moving one of these pawns or knight to c6, they instead start with knight to f6. This would absolutely be a mistake, and you won't see it all too often, but I like to make sure everyone knows what to do in case your opponent does make a mistake. But hopefully you could see that e5 is going to be the right play here. There's no good options here. If the knight moves anywhere except for g8, it is going to fall. You can see both of these light squares right here are covered by the queen from d1 here, and both of these squares right here are covered by the knight. So they come back here to g8. That's not exactly where you want to be. And then I would be extremely aggressive. So I'd start out with d4, trying to control the center as much as possible here. If they exchange, that's fine. This is one of those spots where I think getting the queen involved is acceptable because you have the advantage. Your opponent, if you look at their setup, they haven't moved anything. They moved their knight and then they moved it back. So nothing is moved. One pawn's come off the board. That's completely fine. So even if they play knight to c6 to move the queen, you still want to get the queen involved into the game. You don't just want to come back here to d1. You have to sense weakness from your opponent, continue to attack. So maybe e6 to get their dark square bishop involved into the game. Knight to f3, get your light square bishop involved. Castle on the king side. Both of your bishops can get very, very active in the board, so make sure you do that. But that is an intro to the Closed Sicilian. Again, pretty straightforward. If you're looking for an opening, if you play a lot of e4 early on, maybe you're trying to try stuff out with the King's Gambit or other variations, and you just don't want to see c5 because after you play knight to f3, they have all these variations that are very difficult to deal with sometimes. I would recommend playing the Closed Sicilian. Knight to c3, keep it simple. They really can't disrupt what you're trying to do. Thank you guys so much for watching another chess opening video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.